All right, everybody, welcome. I'm so pleased that you're here with us this evening. I'm Jennifer Miller. I'm a librarian in the Adult Services Department at the Scotch Plains Public Library. I think we have quite a few people from out of state with us this evening. So just for anybody who's not local, Scotch Plains is a lovely community of about 24,000 located in Union County, New Jersey, and you can visit the library website for more information about us. Our speaker this evening is Suzie Flores. Suzie is a New Jersey native, and she was also once a market development executive. And now she and her husband Jay run one of the largest commercial seaweed farms in Connecticut. And when she's not seaweed farming, she's often doing what she's going to do this evening. She's very active in doing outreach and education on the value of ocean farming for creating a sustainable way of raising food and eating it. So I would like to welcome Suzie.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. I was really excited to be asked. Being from New Jersey, I grew up in Essex County, not far from Union County adjacent, and I really miss home. So I'm grateful to even hear the Jersey accents. My name is Suzie Flores. My husband Jay and I own and operate Stonington Kelp Company, which is a aquaculture operation based in the Fisher's Island Sound. This is a little glimpse of what it is that we grow. This is Saccharina latissima, which is a native brown algae that you can find in our area. It grows from the Long Island Sound up to Nova Scotia. It is one of the many edible seaweeds that are native to this area. The breakdown of what we grow, you have the holdfast, which is essentially a root-like structure that grips, that holds the seaweed in place. It does exactly what it says it's going to do. It holds on fast to any sort of substrate underwater. Then you have the
Suzie,
yes.
I'm sorry. Did you advance your slide?
Oh, I did. Is it not? Can you see that?
Yeah, I can see that. So
well, I have to go back
to
show you guys real quick. This beautiful
I'm
image.
sorry. I felt like we were missing something.
Yeah, this is underwater footage of our seaweed farm. And I always like to point out to people our location. We're in the Fisher's Island Sound, which is where the Long Island Sound empties into the Atlantic Ocean. And so we have an incredibly strong current. So this is just an average day on the kelp farm. This isn't a storm or any sort of windy weather. This is just what it looks like all the time. So what we're growing, sugar kelp, as I mentioned, it's a native brown algae. A lot of people who walk along the shore will see this washed up. It is morphologically plastic. So the shape of the seaweed is going to change based on the environment in which it's growing. So you have the holdfast, which is the anchor, essentially. You have the stipe, which looks like a stem, but it actually isn't delivering any nutrition to the blade. It's more of a structural component. And then you have the blade, and the blade primarily is what we sell for food. So we grow our sugar kelp for the food market. In this particular picture, you can see that dark brown stripe down the center of the seaweed. That's called source tissue. That's the reproductive tissue of the sugar kelp. And it actually is very important for the seeding process for kelp. This is another picture from our harvest a year ago, and you can see the source tissue clearly in this shot. And you'll notice that our blade, this is average for our site. Like I said, the seaweed will adapt to the environment in which it's in. So if you have a very, very strong current, which we have at our site, you're going to find that the kelp will grow longer. If you have a more calm environment, less energy, the kelp tends to grow a little bit wider and be more ruffly. And this is so that it can push more water over the surface of the blade. The stipe and the holdfast, so the holdfast looks like roots and the stipe looks like a stem, but the seaweed's actually getting all of its nutrition from the water column and from the sunlight that it can access. Seaweed farming is something that has been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's been happening primarily in Asia. I've read as far back as 600 AD, and it was considered a kind of risky business. In the 1940s, there was a series of typhoons in Japan that wound up decimating their native nori beds. And the industry was really unstable. In fact, it used to be referred to as gambler's grass because it was so difficult to cultivate successfully. Dr. Drew Baker is a phycologist, and she was actually based out of England. She was brilliant, and she studied the life cycles of a type of seaweed that's native to her area called laver. I don't know if there's any English people on the call or people who spend time in the UK, but laver bread is a traditional dish that is made and eaten there. I've actually never tried it. But in her research, she discovered that the laver goes through this stage where this kind of worm-like algae bores into seashells. And when it has access to those shells, it kind of stabilizes the whole production process. And she published a paper on it. And these people involved in the seaweed farms in Japan read this paper and wound up applying the research that she had done. And it wound up stabilizing the entire nori industry. And I just love this story, and I love sharing how far-reaching and impactful her research was, because without her work, this industry would not have succeeded in Japan, and without that, we wouldn't be farming it here in the United States. She passed away very young, unfortunately, and she never actually got to set foot in Japan to be celebrated. However, there is a shrine to her in that's currently is up, and in April every year, I believe it's April 14th, they celebrate her as the mother of the sea, and they have a big celebration, in her honor, recognizing the work that she did, which I think is very cool. So because of her, my husband and I are able to farm in the Fisher's Island Sound. This is a navigational map of the area where we are. We're off of the Stonington, Connecticut harbor. Our farm is actually located in a pretty cool spot because we are right along the water lines of Connecticut, the state of Connecticut, the state of Rhode Island, and the state of New York. In fact, I'm closer to New York than I am to Connecticut. If I ever found myself in a situation, I would probably swim to Fisher's Island in New York. So that means that the incoming tide is coming from, New York state waters, and the outgoing tide is coming from Connecticut state waters. And there I sit in Rhode Island state waters. And there I sit in Connecticut getting nutrition from our neighbors and not having to do much else on my own. So if you look at the little orange rectangle in the bottom left corner of the screen, that is our 10-acre site. We are leasing our farm space from the state of Connecticut, and we grow in approved aquaculture waters. So this is approved for shellfish and other like cultivated aquaculture. In that Stonington Harbor, that is where the last remaining commercial fishing fleet in the state of Connecticut exists. And so there's a lot of fishing activity that happens in this area. The state of Connecticut regulates seaweed the same way that they would regulate any other shellfish. So we have to operate under a special HACCP plan, which is a hazard analysis and critical control points plan. We are subjected to a variety of different tests over the course of our season. And as I mentioned, we have to grow in an area where they have deemed the water quality to be high enough that it can support aquaculture that's going to be consumed by my kids eat it, so I'm glad that they do all of these tests. But it is a rather rigorous process. Our farm is also permitted through the Army Corps of Engineers because we are in a shared resource. This is not, we don't own this site. We only lease the right 6 months out of the year to grow seaweed there. So, if there's fishermen who want to set traps around our area, that's fine, as long as they don't interfere with our gear, because that would be a safety hazard for them. People kayak over it. It's not ours to control. So it is a long and arduous permitting process. We also are permitted to consider various migratory species, various migratory ducks, mammals, turtles, and things like that. So they ensure that the structure of the farm is going to be as safe as possible for kind of all parties involved: human, environmental, and different fish and mammal species. This is essentially this is what a seaweed farm looks like from the top of the water. It is not a ton to look at. It's just a series of buoys and navigational markers. I joke around and say it's one of the most boring farm tours that you can possibly give. But this is what it's rendered to look like under the water. This was actually something taken from our permit, where we have to deliver schematics to the Army Corps of Engineers. So we have anchor structures that we put down in the ocean, and then a horizontal line that a vertical line that goes up to a very buoyant mooring. And then we suspend a horizontal line between those two vertical lines. We usually like to keep it in between 3 and 6 feet from the surface of the water to allow us access to the farm. It doesn't actually look like this in practice. This is another drawing that an artist did that I thought was very pretty, a little bit better than the clip art version that we made for our permit. But what the seaweed actually looks like, because of the current, is it's kind of getting pushed in one direction or the other at all times. This is a picture of the farm. If you notice the little kind of prickly things sticking out, those are the stipes. And so those are blades of seaweed that I've already cut off. We've already harvested at the beginning of that line. And then the long kind of brown, they almost look like lasagna noodles, that's the sugar kelp that we're growing. And you can see just from this picture, the color of the water. We have exceptional water clarity at our site. We test it every year for turbidity. We drop a Secchi disc into the water and just measure how deep we can drop it before we can't see it any longer. And we usually are averaging up until, I'd say, mid-May, when we stop doing the tests and just pull our farm out of the water, around 20 feet deep. So you can see down 20 feet in the water. And this is another picture just kind of over top. This was me coming alongside the boat and just snapping a shot of the seaweed. I like to say it kind of looks like mermaid hair flowing. And again, you can see another example of just how clear the water is. You also have to, remember the water is still very cold when we're farming. The actual farming process takes place from November to usually Memorial Day. So Thanksgiving-ish to Memorial Day-ish. The seaweed is a cold water crop. We outplant our seed stock from wild tissue that we collected. So what we do every September is take divers out to natural kelp beds that are in our area. And this process has been a little bit harder to do every year because these natural kelp beds are receding. They're moving further and further east as the waters start to warm. But we find kelp blades that have that sorus tissue, that brown stripe that's down the center of that. And we'll take that sorus tissue, that sorus tissue goes to a hatchery, a licensed hatchery, and they will induce the sporification process. Essentially what happens is the seaweed wants to reproduce. So they'll put the sorus tissue sample in a fish tank that's holding only a PVC pipe with seawater. And around that PVC pipe is tightly wound about 200 linear feet of kite string. As I mentioned before, the holdfasts like to attach to the substrate underwater. It has to be something that has some sort of texture to it. They don't want to attach to, they can't attach to anything smooth. So by only offering them that kite string in the fish tank, all of the seaweed winds up finding home there. And so it makes it very easy for us to remove that PVC pipe after the seaweed is grown nice and comfortably, and we just outplant it onto our farm. So what you're looking at in this picture is the PVC pipe, all of the kind of brownish, almost fuzzy looking stuff. That's the tiny little baby kelp blades. They're already growing on this pipe. So I'm not seeding it from scratch. I'm using the beautiful research of Dr. Drew Baker and Dr. Charlie Yarish, who is, we joke around and call him the Yoda of seaweed farming. We're using kind of the strategies that they put in place in order to take this already grown tiny little 1 millimeter blade long kelp, and we put it out onto our farm. And the actual process here, what we'll do is we take that horizontal line that we've set out on our farm, and we thread the PVC pipe through it, and then remove the tail end of the kite string, and we splice it into the line. And once it's spliced into the line with a good strong knot, we reattach the 1/2 inch line to one of our, anchored lines. And then we just unfurl it. So you can see in this picture here, I'm splicing it in through the line. And we just motor along the boat very slowly and just allow the seaweed line to unfurl. And that is the seeding process. You're just kind of, in perfect weather, usually you can just pull the rope. You can have someone at the front of the boat pulling it along. We motor it from time to time. You just want to be very delicate. You want to make sure that the line is not rubbing up against anything, and it doesn't slap into the water too hard, because the baby kelp is very fragile. We're looking for certain water and weather conditions when we're outplanting. Obviously, the wind needs to be agreeable. We like to outplant when the water temperatures are below 50 degrees, ideally 45 and lower. And when the air temperature, the ambient temperature, is above 40 degrees, because the kelp is at this stage still pretty delicate and finicky. So once we get this seaweed outplanted, we essentially just let it sit and grow, and it will grow without any interference by us. We tend to the farm. We like to go at least at a weekly basis to just, take a trip out, look at the lines, make sure everything's still attached, all of the gears in the place where it needs to be. Nothing, the lines don't need to be raised or lowered, and let the ocean do the rest. I kind of joke around and say that I can't grow anything on land, but we can grow a ton of seaweed because we have such wonderful water, and so we grow, thousands and thousands of pounds every year. And when we first started this business, my mom was very confused as to why we were doing it, because there's not really much of a market to speak of yet for seaweed in this area. It's a little bit hard to break into, but the environmental benefits that we knew this farm was going to provide to this area's waterways were just too much to kind of pass by. Recently, there was a story in the New York Times that featured Michael Dole, who is a wonderful researcher out of Stony Brook, who grows shallow water seaweed. He also participated in a study recently that talked about how seaweed, when grown near oysters and mussels, helps improve their yield through reducing ocean acidification. So one of the amazing things that kelp does is it extracts the nitrogen from the water, all of that excess nitrogen, which is readily available in areas that are heavily populated. And that's what the seaweed uses to grow. That's like its favorite thing to eat. And so through doing that, it helps improve the amount of oxygen that's in the water. And it's sucking up carbon as well. So every year when we remove our farms from the water, we're removing carbon from the ocean. So it was kind of a no-brainer for us. I mentioned before that we're regulated in the state of Connecticut like other shellfish farms. And that's a really important thing to think about, because in addition to sucking up nitrogen, if there was an excessive amount of heavy metals, for instance, in the waterway in which we were growing seaweed, all of that would be absorbed by the seaweed as well. So it wouldn't be something that we would want to pass on as food for human or animal consumption. There have been some really cool studies. In fact, Michael Dole is a part of one that they just did. I think it was in the Bronx River this year, and then Charlie Yarish participated in one in the Bronx River in 2015, where they used seaweed lines as a way to kind of help restore the waterways back to their previous states. And they used seaweed as a way to absorb a lot of the excessive nutrients that are pumped into the waterways because of human activity. So you see, actually, in this picture, you can see the seaweed lines. This is a farm. The picture on the top right. This is a farm where the seaweed is growing in about 4 feet. I'd say between like 3 and 5 feet at mean and high. Our farm is grown in 30 feet of water, so we access our farm exclusively by boat. The that was kind of the old way of seaweed farming. That was the standard. The new shallow water farms are I think really amazing, and I would love to try to set one up here in New England. But this is, it's been maybe 2 years of kind of research around these shallow water farms proving them out. The more traditional farms that you're going to find in Maine and Alaska and in southern New England are all going to be on average 20 to 30 foot depth. And that's just to allow you to manipulate the seaweed in the water column in case you need to access colder water, and to avoid any sort of biofouling from anything that's living on the bottom of the ocean. And the process of harvesting is fairly simple. In this picture, we use a davit and a winch to lift the seaweed line out of the water. And then you don't even have to bend over. You can just get a knife, cut the seaweed right off, put it in whatever bin or cooler you're going to be keeping it in. And that's it. That's your harvest process. Seaweed is a food that needs to remain cold. It needs to be temperature controlled. So sometimes you have to consider things like on a very sunny day, it can make the seaweed unhappy if you're not harvesting them directly into a cooler and keeping that cooler closed. You don't want to harvest on a rainy day because the fresh water will cause a reaction. The seaweed does not like fresh water. So you want to try to make sure you have some sort of method to protect the seaweed. A lot of the approaches to the seaweed market are different. In Maine, for instance, most of the seaweed farmers up there are commercial fishermen, usually scallop, oyster, lobster fishermen, who will grow their seaweed lines, harvest in like 2 days, everything that they have online. So thousands and thousands of pounds of seaweed. And they will sell it to one specific buyer, and then they're done with it. And that's the end of it. Maine has a more mature seaweed industry. They have a lot of wonderful processing facilities up there. And so it is, I think, like a perfect option. And it's really wonderful because it allows the farmers in Maine who are working in industries where the fisheries might not be producing as much as they once were due to the very quickly warming waters in the Gulf of Maine. It allows them an additional revenue stream. So it kind of is uplifting their working waterfront economy. In southern New England, we don't have that sort of processing infrastructure. So we've had to get a little bit more creative with how we harvest. On our farm and in a lot of the other farmers in this region, we will harvest to order. So we will kind of aggregate requests from various different chefs, and we will harvest as needed on a weekly or biweekly basis. The market for seaweed in this area tends to be institutions like schools, school cafeterias, cafeterias for places like the Mystic Seaport, for instance, and then restaurants. So in order to consolidate that market in a way that has allowed multiple farmers to kind of benefit from our southern New England harvest to order strategy, we started putting on what we call the New England Kelp Harvest. And it's a yearly celebration right when the kelp harvest is kind of right at its peak, which is usually the end of April. We always try to do it around Earth Day. And we will offer programming that educate the public around the benefits of seaweed. For instance, we let people know how incredibly healthy it is, all of the natural minerals that you can get from seaweed, which you can't find necessarily in terrestrial plants, about the omegas that are available in seaweed. Sugar kelp is very high in iron, in calcium, and it's extremely high in iodine. So if you have a sea salt and you add a little bit of crumbled sugar kelp in there, you have added the iodine that's necessary. You don't have to use the table salt, which goes through the process to add more iodine. And then we do dinners with various chefs all across the state. So we've kind of, just because of our location, focused primarily in the state of Connecticut, and we are reaching up or over, I should say, to Rhode Island. And we've been, reaching down into New York to try to find more restaurant partners who are willing to give sugar kelp a try on their menus during the harvest week. In fact, Mena, which is a restaurant in Tribeca, Victoria Blamey, who is just an amazing chef, did a sugar kelp dinner as well as a talk around seaweed earlier this May. It was really fun. So we do this harvest festival, which I know it passed in April, but it's definitely something to keep an ear out for. One of the cool things about kelp is that it's one of the first, I'm going to call it a vegetable, even though it's technically an algae, but it's like one of the first vegetables that are available. It's out before, any of the other farms are, have anything really to present. So it's a nice time of year to start eating your greens again, so to speak. And these are some of the dishes that we've seen come out of this Seaweed Week. We have a cucumber seaweed salad. We have a lot of chefs who've been using it as a noodle replacement. So clams linguine, and they've added, strips of sugar kelp just sliced down by hand. In the bottom right, you see one of my favorites. They used the stipes, the stems that they look like stems. They took the stipes at the end of the season and pickled them, and they were just absolutely amazing. And so that's becoming more and more popular. What's interesting about those is the seaweed will regrow. So if you think about it, not to sound gross, but if you think about it like hair, when you give it a haircut, it's going to continue growing over the course of the season. And so there's a lot of really interesting strategies for how I farm in order to reduce yield. I will crop the seaweed, give the seaweed a bob in a 4-foot section, and then I'll move down the line a couple other feet. So that's kind of reducing the amount of competition that the seaweed has against itself on the lines. But so we really only remove the stipes at the very end of the season. So the stipes kind of this would be the tail end of stipe season. It's really right around Memorial Day. And we'll just have a ton of them, 5-gallon buckets, and we'll just find whatever chef wants to try something new with them. But the pickled stipes has been absolutely one of my favorites. And then this is a roasted chicken. So seaweed can be used as a pasta. You can take dried seaweed and reconstitute it and use it in a salad. And you can also dry the seaweed and use it as a salt substitute. It's in the umami kind of wheelhouse, right? That savory sort of flavor profile. It's called sugar kelp, but that's kind of misleading. It's called sugar kelp because it has a higher mannitol concentration, and that's a naturally occurring sugar. It's higher than any other kelp that's out there. It can be used as a flavor enhancer for other desserts. I have a chef who uses it in flan. I have a chef who uses it in a caramel latte. So it definitely has that flavor enhancing quality that most umami foods have. But it's definitely not sweet. When you take a bite out of it, it's not, it's no lollipop. So I mentioned, I kept talking about what we've been doing. And that is because after a couple years of my husband and I kind of going at it alone, I found that I was always reaching out to other farmers trying to get their opinions on, you know, little things, big things. You know, are you having a good year? Like, you know, what are you doing? How are you avoiding having your buoys, you know, tear kelp off the line? And it was such a wonderful community of people that we decided to formalize it, and we created, myself and all the other farmers in southern New England created the Sugar Kelp Cooperative. And so we just worked together to try to share sales channels. We share market development, marketing, delivery expenses, and we work as a collective to try to stabilize the supply, which is really important for a growing industry, so that chefs are comfortable getting recurring orders from us and keeping sugar kelp on the menu for as long as they possibly can. So the cooperative is what puts on the Sugar Kelp Harvest Week every year. And at the end of the season, anything that we have left over, we like to partner with local farms. I mentioned that sugar kelp absorbs a ton of the nitrogen in the water, and that absorbing the nitrogen is great for the water because it can reduce harmful algal blooms. It also can help improve ocean oxygen levels and reduce ocean acidification. But nitrogen is also something that people love in their soil because it can help improve root strength for seedlings. Since the seaweed is so high in nitrogen, anything excess that we have on the farm, the holdfasts, any extra stipes, you know, the blades of kelp that just didn't make it to the market, or maybe weren't pretty enough to make it to the market, we take all of that out of the ocean so that we're removing all of the carbon from the ocean. And then in some instances, we will dry it in a greenhouse, or we'll just take it and put it into burlap bags, and we provide it to farms to allow them to incorporate that as an organic soil input. And, you know, having the seaweed as a soil amendment can help reduce the chemical nitrogen fertilizers that people apply to the farms, which then don't process through the soil properly, leach into the water, and then cause excess nitrogen in the waterways. So it is another way to kind of stop the cycle to help improve our water quality from a land perspective. And I like to think that it does its work on the ocean and then it does its work on the land. So it's really nice in that way. Also, it allows us to not waste anything on our farms. So I will stop here and take any questions if anybody has any. But if you wanted to kind of be a part of this kelp movement, I would say a couple next steps would be to start asking around at restaurants, markets, garden centers for locally sourced kelp. A lot of people ask me, you know, where can I buy your products? And try as I may, a lot of people don't want to carry our, you know, seaweed because they don't hear the demand for it. So I would say, you know, raise your voices, please, and ask for that locally sourced kelp. I like to say very specifically, I'm not talking about cultivated at my farm. I'm saying even domestically cultivated, even seaweed that comes from California is still better than seaweed that's coming from overseas. And over 90% of seaweed, just like other seafoods, are getting shipped in from international countries. And in those countries, you don't have the same sort of standards around water quality, how the seaweed is grown, food safety standards. So definitely try to keep it local, understand where it's being grown. I would also say try incorporating some domestically cultivated kelp into your diet right away. We have several products that are value add products at this time, as well as dried seaweed, hot sauce. We have an awesome sugar kelp hot sauce that you can purchase made by Decimation Hot Sauce. We have a sugar kelp shoyu. It's a sugar kelp soy sauce made by Moromi Soy Sauce. Atlantic Sea Farms is a Maine-based sugar kelp company that partners with over 30 different farmers to do a variety of different kelp products. And you can find a lot of their products at Whole Foods. And also Alaskan Kelp Barnacle Foods has a whole array of pickles and hot sauces as well. And they're a wonderful family-owned company. They're really cool people. Please follow my farm, please, and the Sugar Kelp Cooperative as well to learn more about upcoming events that we're doing regionally. I think that we're doing something in Montclair, New Jersey in the summer. At the end of the summer, it's going to be a kelp cooking class. And then anybody interested in farming on their own, or who just wants to learn more about the farming process, there is a plethora of resources at the greenwave.org/hub. Greenwave is a nonprofit based out of New Haven that is dedicated to supporting and uplifting aspiring ocean farmers. And they have put together essentially a whole curriculum that you can take online free to learn, how to pick a site, how to tie knots, how to get anchors, how to make anchors, how to start your own hatchery if you wanted to start that hatchery process on your own. And then the seaweedhub.org is a also free resource created by the Sea Grant people. And it is a nationwide kind of a place for a lot of resources, including different regulatory resources and a lot of fun legal stuff that you can get into. And I will stop talking there and please let me know if there are any questions.
There are definitely several questions already in the chat. So I'm just going to go through them. Let me first say thank you so much. This is absolutely fascinating. And I'm especially glad that you addressed those points about what we can do, locally to encourage this industry. Because that was going to be my question. Sorry, I just lost the chat. Okay. Just gotta get to that. Okay, since kelp takes up excess nitrogen, humans discharge into the waters, does that affect the edibility of the kelp for human consumption?
No, so my seaweed is tested every year. We do nutritional panel, and then we do heavy metal panels, and then they do a whole panel for bacteria and any sort of hazardous arsenics, things like that. And it cannot be sold for human consumption unless it hits all of the guidelines that we're required to meet through the FDA.
Okay, this is an interesting question. What new tool or tools would you like to invent, I guess, for farming purposes?
Well, right now, one of the big struggles that we're having in my area and in our region is, I mentioned before, the seaweed is migrating east. So the natural kelp beds are migrating east. So if there were ways to find seaweed that, perhaps was, it adapts very well, but if we could figure out, what phenotype of seaweed would adapt for waters that are unfortunately starting to warm, that would provide a little bit of respite for some of the farms that are further west, closer to New York City, as well as a lot of the farms that are out on Long Island as well.
Yeah, maybe that ties into, I think this is the same person. Next question, do you do any DNA analyses on your source kelps to see if the diversity is appropriate at the source and at harvest, and you don't have a monoculture?
So we always find wild kelp stock. They won't allow us to use, I say they, the department, the Bureau of Aquaculture doesn't want us to use source tissue that is produced on our own farm. So we always take divers out and we'll go and hunt for wild kelp. And that is their strategy to essentially ensure that we're getting, we're supporting whatever is in the wild at the time, rather than just taking the same parent kelp tissue year over year. That being said, there's researchers who are arguing that it doesn't matter, that if you went ahead and you use the same seaweed, if it's adapted to this area, perhaps that kind of solves the problem that I hoped that we could solve, that, if it's growing strong and healthy on your farm, just keep using that same seed stock. When the kelp spores, so there's always kelp on my farm that spores, the cloud of, they call it the cloud, essentially all of the reproductive spores that are coming out, they don't travel very far. Usually it's just a couple meters, maybe a little bit further on my site, because our current is so incredibly strong. And I had hoped that by having, the large farm out there and seaweed sporing, it would help repopulate some of these struggling kelp beds, but I'm told by Dr. Charlie Arish that that's not the case.
Okay, there's a hypothesis that humans came to North America by following the kelp beds from Russia to present day Alaska, feeding themselves without waiting for the Bering Sea to recede for a land bridge. Any idea what kinds of kelp the first people might have used?
I've read about that. The Kelp Highway is what that was referred to, and it's really interesting. The idea is that rather than going through uh, the land bridge, people followed along the shore, and they used, I think what the type of kelp they would have used would have been bull kelp or something very closely related to bull kelp, but they were taking advantage of the amount of biodiversity that naturally occurs in these kind of kelp forests. So there'd be more fish. It's a habitat for fish. The kelp itself would serve as something they could anchor onto. Surfers out on the West Coast still will, paddle out, and if they want to kind of stay in one spot, they'll hang on to the seaweed because the bull kelp is very, very strong, very, very tall. So they would use that essentially as an anchor. I really love that theory. I love the idea that the Kelp Highway was what helped people this area. And I think I read about it in National Geographic. So I don't know. I haven't seen anything else outside of that one kind of piece, but I thought it was very interesting. But yes, it would have been bull kelp or giant kelp.
Okay. What is the sodium level of seaweed, and can you reduce it?
It's not as high as salt, but it's still pretty high. You can reduce it. You can reduce all of the levels of everything that's inside of it through boiling it. When I harvest seaweed and dry it in the early season, for myself, I tend to I don't even rinse it. I'll put it right in the dehydrator and dry it out because I like to have that salt. I like to use that as a salt substitute. Once you blanch the seaweed, so you submerge it in fresh, close to boiling water for just a quick second, a couple things are going to happen. But one of them is that you will lose a lot of that punchy flavor. You're going to lose, it's going to reduce the amount of iodine that's in it, not necessarily enough for somebody who is very sensitive to high levels of iodine. But you're gonna melt away a couple of the pigments that color seaweed, and you'd be left with when you put in kind of that olive amber blade, you're gonna pull out almost instantly like this electric green blade of seaweed, and that's actually the pigments melting away and leaving only chlorophyll to color the seaweed. That winds up changing the flavor from tannic to extremely mild. And I think that a lot of chefs tend to serve seaweed in that state unless they're using it as a seasoning. We actually have a partnership with one of the schools in our like in this area, in the New London County area, and they use the seaweed as a way to reduce the amount of salt that they put in the kids' meals, because it can kind of have that same effect. It does add sodium, but it doesn't add as much as salt. And because it is that umami flavor, it'll enhance the other flavors of the dish in the same way. So to answer your question, it depends on the state in which you've gotten your seaweed. And if you're going to, submerge it in water, rinse it off. If you're getting those seaweed snacks, for instance, those things are like loaded with salt, but that's because they'll add more preservatives and things like that to it as well.
And this is more of a comment. What a terrific project for biology department and students to work on, which it's, I totally agree. There's a lot of educational material that's involved.
There's so I mentioned Michael Dole. He's the guy that did that wonderful New York Times piece that came out last week. He's doing a lot of work in New York City. So if there are people, I know it's a short train ride from Scotch Plains. He's doing a lot of work, and it's all about mitigating excessive nutrients. It's not necessarily growing it for food because there are so many other funky things in the water going on there. But the Billion Oyster Project as well, which is based in New York, is working on putting a seaweed line for the same reason, to just kind of see the impact. Can they get more oysters to grow if they're growing it adjacent to seaweed? Can they, produce that halo effect? And what is that going to do to the water quality? I mean, the biggest thing we can do is to stop polluting the water, but another nice thing would be to add some filtering and sustainable life in there as well.
I have a question. You mentioned that your kids eat the seaweed. Is there a particular form or dish that they especially like?
My son likes it all. Like if we're out on the boat, and now he's a second grader. Well, he'll be a rising third grader. He will eat it right off the boat. He loves the stipes. He loves the blades. They all love the pickled stipes. That's a really easy win. And then when we blanch it and we use it like we would a pasta, it tends to be a really big hit. But I think that the biggest fan favorite among everybody is we do seaweed and chocolate chip cookies. And so if you've ever had a cookie with like sea salt on top, we're just using dried seaweed flakes on top, and those move pretty quick.
Yeah, I believe that. And then I was also wondering, you were talking about when you lay the spores out in April, or no, in November or December. The water is pretty cold. Is that challenging? Does that present certain hazards or challenges working in such cold?
Yeah, you have to be. I have learned in this process that you can't push it. If the weather doesn't agree, then you just have to humbly say, not today, and we're just going to have to go out another time. And that the same is true for harvesting as well. You have to understand that you have to pay attention to the weather. You have to pay attention to the currents and tides. And we never go to the farm alone. We are fortunately very close to a Coast Guard station. We're near the Coast Guard Academy in New London. So it's winter. There's no recreational boaters to speak of. We have some fishermen that travel nearby. And then we also know the Coast Guard isn't that far away. So that does put me at ease a little bit, but it is dangerous. It can be dangerous. You have to worry about things like ice. If you break down, you need to know that you need to have a plan. We always travel with life suits in the winter. In the spring, the bigger concern for harvesting is it tends to be really windy here around April. So when you're anchoring into a line that's 30 feet deep, and you have a current and wind, working against you, it can very easily swamp your boat. So we've learned to kind of respect the ocean and just only access the farm when it's safe to do so.
Okay. Does anybody else have any further questions? You can also unmute yourself if you want to speak up, or type it into the chat. And reminder, we are recording this, so it will be available again for future viewing on our YouTube channel, or you could share it with somebody you think might be interested. I do want to mention, and I forgot to bring in the show and tell, but the library has a copy of a memoir by Bren Smith, who is actually the founder of Green Wave. So I think he talks a lot about how he motivated to pursue this type of ocean farming versus commercial fishing, and just a lot of insight into the nature of the industry and why it's such a great way forward for us. Lovely comments coming in. Thank you. Great talk. Lots of great info. I totally agree. You're a wealth capitalized of really interesting information. This has been a terrific presentation. Yes, I totally agree. This is just fascinating. That's it. Thank you. Great talk. California signing off. Goodbye, California. Thanks for being with us. So I really wish you and the whole industry the best. It's really important work.
It's definitely a lot of fun.
Well, that's good. I'm very glad to hear that. And it's been really fun to hear all about it. So, so thank you so much, Suzie, and thank you everybody for joining us this evening. It's been really fun.
Oh, I just saw something come up on the chat.
Oh,
What are you reading? All We Can Save. I don't know if you've read that, Dr. Ayana Johnson. That's a good one. It's a collection of essays. Actually, Emily Stengel, who's the co-founder of Green Wave, Bren and Emily are the two founders. She contributes to that essay, that collection of essays. It's highly recommend.
it's a great question. Thank you so much. This was wonderful. Yeah. All right. So I'm going to end the recording.